This. Hey everyone, so I'm happy to report that we've successfully closed the external survey on code review problems or experience problems, and we've had a total of 244 responses. We were aiming for at least 100, so this is great. I made a comment there below about having a lot of bots / spam responses, a lot of them. And it seems like it's a recurring problem, and I'll have to, we'll have to talk about this internally. But yeah, that was the total number of responses. Kai, you're asking about refer information. We do, but it's very basic. We only get if they came from an email or from somewhere else. We don't say, it doesn't say if it comes from Twitter or from no refer or no, it's just coming from anywhere on the web or from an email client. That's what we get. But yeah, it's I had to manually triage it, and there were a lot of strange responses, basically. If you're curious, I'll can let you know at the end of the call so that we don't waste time on it, but it was very strange. The results so far, haven't done a thorough analysis, but the top 3 problems are not that different from the internal survey. The number 1, dealing with large MRs. The second one, knowing what happened since I last visited an MR. Those 2 are exactly the same as the internal survey. The third one is different. In this case, external respondents classified communicating / understanding the intention of changes as one of the top problems. And on the bottom, from most to least important, we have communicating, understanding the intention of comments, balancing reviews with other daily tasks, and finding appropriate reviewers for an MR. If I'm not mistaken, compared to the internal survey, the only difference is that finding appropriate reviewers for an MR was higher on the list. It was not at the bottom. This is interesting to say the least, but I'll have to also filter the responses based on team size, because if I imagine that if it's a very small team, it doesn't have that much need to find an appropriate reviewer. But if it's a very large team or organization, that they would have a harder time. Any comments or questions so far? All right. And then some interesting recurring themes that came up in the open text responses. People talking about how difficult it is to know what has happened in an MR, what's new, what they've already seen. So that whole catch up theme. The second one is perhaps related to that, is difficult to parse the activity feed with many threads and comments. Kai, go ahead. I can write it for you.
I was going to ask, is this large MR like in the sense that it's trying to think of, like, lots of comments and threads make an MR large? I think that's one version of a large MR. The other version of a large MR is like lots of code changes. So are these sort of in that camp of like those comments felt like large MR things, and they were large MRs because of lots of comments and stuff, and not large MRs because there's lots of code, I guess, is sort of the way I'm trying to think about it. Like, because those are 2 different, like, we sort of arbitrarily call all of that a large MR, and we think about that as one giant problem, but they are 2 things that have similar symptoms and similar like problems, but there are different experiences.
Yeah, they're definitely related. I think it's difficult to define the line between them. But I think it's a mix of just the visual design that makes it hard to parse, even if you don't have a lot of activity. And at the same time, it's just very large activity feeds and how mentally taxing that is, which again is related to the catching up on an MR problem. So I think all of these have like a confluation point, which is the activity feed, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I was thinking, we're, as a group, we sort of talked last week about shifting towards thinking about large MRs and thinking about what we could do in that experience, and also battling it from a performance perspective. So I now wonder if large MRs as a topic of rank by problem, which I guess we knew this would do, is not specific enough to know what kind of large MR problem they're talking about, and if we need to dig in further just on that sort of piece to understand it better. But that's fine.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do now with the research synthesis, and I'm almost done with it. And there is clearly, to put it short, because so I don't want to deviate from the topic, but it seems like it's just what people are more concerned about is just the pure performance. That's what I can interpret from the research that I've seen so far. Not so much. There are some things about being like the efficiency as a separate aspect, but there's a very big focus on just slow things and loading times, and not so much about clicking and about managing views. It's just how slow it is, and sometimes not showing all of the changes, and you have to click to load them and recollapse them. So those things that are related to just the backend side of backends, I mean, in terms of not the UI itself. Then many people, I was surprised, were talking, didn't link to this issue, but they were all talking along the lines of what that issues wants to solve. The display change that made thread outdated inline. A lot of people were saying, I see a comment, it's changed, but I don't see the comment in the changes tab because it was outdated. So I have to go back and forth. And many people, at least 2 or 3, said, hey, I have to keep a tab open on the changes tab and a tab open on the overview tab on separate browser tabs, just to know, hey, this comment was made on that line and I don't know what changed, so I can go back and forth. So this was very interesting, and it's in line with what we're prioritizing in this milestone. Some people mentioning that they want that request attention or waiting for, so that they can mark the ends of a review and like passing the token between reviewers and authors. The need for always up-to-date merge request page information without having to refresh. The mentions were specific about the pipelines, for example, that they're not always up to date and they have to refresh and they're not as fast. And yeah, but there are a couple specific mentions there, but in general, it's just like it's not up to date. I make a change, I have to refresh it, or things are not appearing as in real time as I thought it would be. The squash commit message arbitrary behavior, which we're changing this milestone. I think the MR is already in. If not, it should be soon. It's already in. Okay. So yeah, and a lot of people disliking that behavior. And so that's another encouragement for us to pursue that. And of course, performance was in a lot of the comments. Um, any questions?
You mentioned synthesizing all of it. I expect we'll get like not a
An
mural.
Amazon package with everything. Yeah,
The
no,
other
I'll
one. What's
do
the other
like
one? Not mural, right? It's not mural. It's the other one that we have that I don't remember. Dovetail.
dovetail.
Yeah, are you putting it all in Dovetail, right? Is that the next step?
Yeah,
Or are
my
you?
idea. I'll try to, if we have time tomorrow, to discuss this with Sanjung. My idea so far is to import all of the data to Dovetail, both the internal and the external survey, into the same project, so that we can then relate both the surveys and analyze them and extract the insights. But yeah, this was just my understanding looking through the responses today, because I had to triage all of them and see what were spam and what was not spam. So while doing that, I was taking notes. And yeah, and then the large MR, you can see it for yourself there in the agenda. But it's, yeah, a lot of focus on the number of changed files and the number of changed lines. There wasn't a lot of emphasis in the number of commits or the number of comments or activity. But I have the assumption, at least for the commits, that it's just because most teams do not follow like a commit by commit review flow. So they're not very concerned about the number of commits. It could have 100 commits. They're always reviewing the latest version. But yeah, and praise. There are other praises there in general. People really enjoying the experience. So not everything is bad. Um, they're saying they're liking what we're doing. Some people even say like, there's nothing that I can um, suggest or change. I think it's really good. There are some things here and there, and specific praise for multi-line comments, Mark is viewed, suggestions in general, and the recent addition of reviewers. And related to these recent features that we've introduced, it was interesting that some respondents were asking for them at the same time. So not the same people that were praising, of course, but other respondents were saying, I would like multi-line comments. I would like to mark files as viewed, or I'd like reviewers. Maybe they're not in the latest version. I didn't check. Comments, questions?
Thank you. I think you did an awesome job putting the survey together, and then I don't know how we drove to nearly 250 responses, but but it feels pretty good, because I know a lot of groups it takes a long time to get there. So I feel like whatever we did worked. That's why I was sort of curious about the reviewer stuff. But yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. Also, thank you to you for resharing on social media. I know that Marcel, he also shared it, and that drove a bit up the number of responses. But I think what sealed the deal was that at a certain point, I think the GitLab Twitter account saw that we were talking about this, and they retweeted one of our tweets, and so that exploded, I think, not only the number of humans but the number of bots. Yeah, that's all I have. If there's no other comments about this point, I'm okay with moving on to Kai.
Cool. The next two are sort of FYIs. The first one is there's a meeting next week to talk with the compliance folks about yet another sort of approval concept in merge requests. And I know it looks like it was discussed months ago, and I'm not sure there was a great resolution then. And now they're sort of even further down this path, and even more worried about the concept they're introducing. And so just trying to get on the same page with them and make sure that we understand what they're doing and agree that it's the right path to go, so that we don't introduce another confusing concept into something that sort of muddies two other concepts that we already have and like impact the experience. And I think this also comes from a place of knowing that like ultimately, is users run into issues, or if they run into issues with this, we'll end up being the first group that has to sort of like triage and understand everything in order to get it back to the right groups, as how that's historically worked. And so we just need to make sure that this is something we're okay with, or that we understand well enough, or we think is solving the problem in a way that is consistent with the experience that we're trying to deliver. I think this is the first this is an ideal case of where the ownership page stuff that Pedro and I are working on would come in handy, where we're saying, you know, this is one of those, I would say, top level things where like, oh, you want to introduce a new approval concept, like here's who you need to talk to and like who needs to approve this and buy in before you even like get down as far as they are in the path. And so I think I definitely think they should we should try and figure that out. And I believe, yes, Pedro, to your question, I pinged Daniel and Mike in my thread on the Epic and asked if they wanted to also come to the meeting. So I haven't, neither one of them has responded, but I did ping them. I think it's twofold. I think some of this is approval rules in terms of backend technology, and some of this is merge request experience.
So you were mentioning the ownership of the merge request experience. So this falls on in the middle. So it's as you're saying, it's approval rules, but it's also merge request UX. So we would also need to, or the source code group would also be encouraged to set up their own ownership model in a way, right?
I think so. I think because this is now down a path where they have solutioned it, I think that's why it is crossing both those bridges, right? Because they're deciding to solution this in approval rules, that sort of makes it a source code piece of interest and a merge request, like a code review piece of interest. If they hadn't solutioned this yet and had instead, if we had sort of this ownership model in place and it said, this is what you're trying to do, come and talk to us. They might not use approval rules. I think you said this in a comment previously. I look at it and I don't know why this is an approval rule, right? Like I think you and I would both agree that what they're trying to accomplish is not an approval rule thing. It's a merge check, because it is an external system that is validating that something can be merged. It is not a user action, right? Is sort of the difference. And so at that point, if that's what we had said, then source code, then it wouldn't be an approval rule thing, and source code wouldn't need to necessarily be aware of what's going on, because we're now in a much like cloudier phase of this. I think that's why source code should be more informed here. But we should have started with the merge request experience, right? Like that. Then that's, I think, the piece that we need to keep in mind is like, yeah, we always start with the experience and then figure out how to solve for that experience, not start with solutions and then build those into experiences and by like cobbling it all back together. And I don't know what will come out of the discussion with them, but and I don't know if we can pump the brakes on it, or if we're going to end up with this and then spend a lot of time trying to rework ourselves back out of it. But the faster we can get ahead of this and have stronger opinions, I think the better.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember because I also think I was involved in this discussion. I think what they're trying to do is it's the API to create approval rules on the fly, basically, more or less. And I had a lot of discussion with who was it? With Matt, I think, and Austin about, to me, like if we're calling an API and we're blocking the merge, why don't we use pipelines for this? So it would be a job in a pipeline, and if the job fails, but then he explained to me that they're trying to distance themselves from the pipeline because they want compliance jobs to be separate from the rest of the other code quality jobs, which to a certain extent you can also have compliance things there. You could have a job failing because it doesn't meet the security compliance or something like that. It's not compliant with the security practices. But he told me that they wanted to be separate because some organizations have tools for compliance that are external to GitLab, and those tools, those compliance tools, would then speak with GitLab to allow or disallow something to be merged. That's where I think I left off. I'm not sure how far ahead this is, but that's the impression that I got.
Yeah, that is the impression that I got, and I think that conversation, I linked it down below in the previous discussion. That's where you had that with Austin before and Matt. I think they went ahead anyways and are doing this as an approval. It's like a sort of the way it works based on the screenshots is that like in a merge request, you can now define an approval rule. And instead of defining an approval rule, that approval rule actually gets like an API endpoint of a third-party system. And that third-party system is then responsible for passing or failing that approval rule somehow. Yes. It's going to get notified and somehow it's going to pass or approve it. Yeah. And that is where they are on that. And it shows up based on all the UI stuff. It shows up inside of approval rules. It has its own term, but it is inside of that approval rules widget. I don't know how it talks to that thing. I don't know how often it will talk to that thing. I don't know what happens if that service is down or it doesn't respond in a way that we expect it to respond, or I would have a bunch of questions once we see that. But the first question is sort of, is that even the right place for that kind of experience, versus should the merge button just not be able to turn blue if that check comes back? And I think that gets into what we're talking about in sort of the next one that I have on the agenda, which is like better defining the terminology and understanding sort of like the user experiences of those things, because in my mind, approval rules are a user actionable thing. Like I, as a user, can see that it is an approval rule and requires me to go find a person in that list to approve it. And like, I know how to solve that. And I think this is one of those things where like, if that comes back as a red X, I, as a developer, sit there and go, cool, how do I fix this and who do I talk to? Because there's no picture here and there's no person here and there's nothing that tells me anything about what failed. It just is now a red X.
Yeah. When I might share this again in the call, but the way that I think what we're lacking now is just we don't have, as you said, not only the correct shared terminology, but we also don't have a good model for what they're trying to do. And for example, in Azure DevOps, what they have is they do it at the branch level, but you can imagine that this could also be at the project level for us. They have a lot of different policies, like requiring a number of approvals, checking for comment resolution, so all threads are resolved, blah, blah, blah. And then they have these 3 sections. One is for building validation, which I would translate this to our pipelines succeeding or not. And you can have policies here for the CI/CD things. And then you have status checks, which is another thing to require other services to post successful status to complete pull requests. And I think this is what they're after. And what we're trying to do is separate this from the approval rules, which here they call automatically include reviewers, and you can make them required, blah, blah, blah. There are a lot of things here. So this is, I think, what we're missing is this separate part, which separates it from approvals. So it's not an approval. It's another external service that posts a result. But I'll share it there in the call.
Yeah, I would agree. I think we're missing a piece, and we just need to be careful about moving quickly with a boring solution in the merge request. So we're up at time. The last one is the better defined terminology thread. I think everyone on this call has chimed in or potentially chimed in. I would say keep looking at it. I honestly threw it out there as a way to sort of spark the conversation, because it came up with Catherine when we were talking about merge widgets, and like which ones was she going to go research, and we had to sort of say these are the things that we're calling merge widgets in this context, and we did that on the call. And then I asked Phil about it in a comment on an issue, and Phil is very well versed in merge widgets, and I said, and he wrote the merge widget extension API, and I said, what would it take to build like a generic merge widget extension? And then his response back to me was like, well, what exactly are you talking about? And I had to specify with Phil, like these things here, not this one down here. And I was like, okay, it's clearly a recurring theme for the group that we don't, and I don't know if we need to do it externally. Internally, we just need to have a better way to talk about all of these things. And maybe that results in a page in Docs that's sort of like, this is all of the things that are in that top area of a merge request and what they're all called. And so that way sales has an easier language for them, and engineering has an easier language for them. And it's easier for us to say, these are the kinds of things that the types of information that can go in each one of these pieces. Mine was really just prompting and sort of like throwing out how I've been mental modeling all of them, but I'm happy for more people to chime in and sort of, how do we get to a point where, and I think Amy's idea of like, let's have a picture with arrows pointing and definitions and all of that is like the ultimate answer to this. So we can stop asking, what are you talking about every time it comes up?
Yeah, I think it's great. I had nothing to chime in with at the moment, but I will say that before this research started, I was like 100% sure it was the merge request widget. Like the whole thing was just the merge request widget. And then when we started talking about it, I was like, wait, are there widgets in the widget? Are they all just separate widgets? What is happening? So yes, I 100% agree with the need to like align on it, at least internally.
It will end up going externally, because this is actually a problem I've noticed in the documentation, that we provide a step-by-step of, okay, you go to the merge request page, and then you scroll to the thing that has no name. This totally does not work for users. So yes, I'm going to steal whatever you choose.
Perfect. Well, I think that's it. Pedro, you can look at the weekly sync one. There's 2 open MRs that I think you're tagged as a reviewer on, if you get a chance. I know lots of other things going on, but I was going to remind people tomorrow on that one as well.
Okay, cool. Thanks for the reminder. I'll check them out.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for all the research and stuff. And yeah, we'll keep moving forward.
Bye, everyone.